The gardens of Hartwick Manor bloomed with late spring abundance, roses climbing the ancient stone walls in cascades of cream and blush, their perfume mingling with the sharper scent of boxwood hedges, trimmed to geometric precision, and across the manicured lawns, society gathered like butterflies drawn to nectar, ladies in pastel silks and gentlemen in dark coats, forming clusters of conversation and laughter beneath a sky so achingly blue it seemed painted by an optimistic hand. Eleanor Hartwick stood at the periphery of it all, positioned near the reflecting pool where the light played tricks with shadow, her dove-grey dress chosen specifically to blend rather than attract, to suggest the wallpaper rather than the portrait, and she had perfected this art over 23 years of being the second daughter, the practical one, the sister who existed in the negative space around Rosalind's luminous beauty. She watched the assembled guests with the careful attention of someone who had learned to observe rather than participate, noting Mrs. Pemberton's new ruby necklace and Lord Ashworth's poorly concealed interest in the widow Fairfax. These small dramas playing out while Eleanor remained invisible as heir, and she had long ago accepted this as her natural state, had even found a certain peace in it, for there was safety in not being seen, in not having expectations placed upon shoulders that had learned to bear only the weight of duty. Then the Duke of Ashford arrived, and the very quality of the afternoon seemed to shift, a collective intake of breath rippling through the gathering as all eyes turned toward the entrance where he stood, tall and commanding in his bearing, dark hair touched with traces of silver at the temples, though he could not yet be 35, his features carved with aristocratic precision, and something else, something that made Eleanor pause despite herself, a quality of stillness that suggested depths beneath the polished surface. She observed him as she observed everything, from her safe distance, noting the way he greeted their father with genuine warmth rather than mere obligation, how his eyes scanned the crowd, not with arrogance but with what might have been wariness, or perhaps loneliness, though Eleanor chided herself for such fanciful interpretation, for what could a duke possibly know of loneliness? And then his gaze found Rosalind, and Eleanor felt something in her chest constrict, a sensation she could not name but recognized as the beginning of an ending, for she saw in that moment how his expression shifted, how the careful guardedness gave way to something like wonder as he beheld her sister standing beneath the wisteria arbor, sunlight catching the gold of her hair and turning her into something mythical, a creature too lovely for the mundane world. Rosalind, accustomed to such attention, smiled with practiced grace, and Eleanor watched as the Duke crossed the lawn with purpose, his path as inevitable as sunrise, and she knew with sudden, crushing certainty that she was about to become a witness to something that would alter the course of all their lives. She saw him bow, heard the murmur of introduction though she stood too far to distinguish words, watched as Rosalind extended her hand and the Duke took it with reverence, and then he was leading her sister toward the temporary dance floor laid out on the east lawn, and the musicians began to play, and Eleanor retreated further into the shadows cast by the garden wall, making herself smaller still, invisible entirely, as the Duke of Ashford requested Rosalind's first dance, and Eleanor's long vigil of silent suffering began. Weeks passed, and the Duke's courtship of Rosalind became the singular focus of London society. Every call he paid to Hartwick Manor, dissected and discussed in drawing-rooms across Mayfair, every flower he sent examined for symbolic meaning. And Eleanor found herself thrust into an unexpected role, for propriety demanded that Rosalind never be alone with her suitor, and so Eleanor became their constant companion, their chaperone and shadow, sitting in corners of parlours with needlework she scarcely saw, walking 3 paces behind them in gardens while pretending deafness to their conversation, and in this enforced proximity she began to notice things about the Duke that others missed in their fascination with his title and fortune. She observed his genuine interest when their father spoke of agricultural improvements, not the polite attention of a man courting favour, but real engagement with ideas, and she noticed how he treated the servants with courtesy rather than dismissal, remembering names and asking after ailing family members, and there was a quality of loneliness about him despite his social position, a careful guardedness that reminded Eleanor of her own practiced invisibility. He was unfailingly proper with Rosalind, attentive without being presumptuous, but Eleanor began to sense something missing in their interactions, a lack of true connection beneath the scripted courtship, though she told herself such observations were merely wishful thinking born of her own inappropriate and growing fascination. The family's expectations mounted with each visit, her mother already planning the wedding that would elevate the Hartwick name, her father calculating settlements and alliances, and Rosalind accepted it all with the confidence of one who had never doubted her own desirability, who viewed the Duke's interest as natural and inevitable as dawn following darkness. Eleanor's internal conflict intensified until it became a constant ache in her chest, for she was drawn to him in ways she could not allow herself to acknowledge. Noticing the intelligence in his grey eyes and the kindness in his rare smiles, the way he listened with genuine attention and spoke with careful consideration, and she despised herself for these feelings, for what kind of sister coveted what was meant for another? Then came the afternoon that changed everything, or perhaps simply illuminated what had already begun, when Eleanor dropped an armful of books while descending the main staircase, the volumes tumbling and scattering across the marble floor in a cascade of leather and paper, and she knelt to gather them in flustered embarrassment, expecting the footman to assist. But it was the Duke who appeared beside her, having just arrived for his appointed call with Rosalind, and he knelt on the polished floor in his fine coat and helped collect the scattered books, and as he handed her a worn copy of Wordsworth, their fingers touched, and his eyes met hers, and he said with unexpected warmth, "You have excellent taste in poetry, Miss Eleanor," and she realized with shock that he knew her name, her actual name, and not just her designation as Rosalind's sister, and something in his expression as he looked at her made her heart stop and restart with painful force. They stood there in the entrance hall, books between them like a bridge, and he asked what she thought of Wordsworth's treatment of nature and memory, and for perhaps 3 minutes they conversed, truly conversed, about poetry and philosophy and the way beauty could break the heart. And Eleanor felt seen for the first time in her life, wholly visible and recognized, until Rosalind's voice called from above, asking what detained him, and reality crashed back with crushing weight, and Eleanor stepped away with a murmured excuse and fled to her room, where she pressed her hands against her burning cheeks and acknowledged the terrible truth that she was developing feelings for the man who would marry her sister. The season ended without a formal proposal, though everyone understood it was merely a matter of time, and Eleanor endured the summer, knowing that autumn would bring the inevitable conclusion to a courtship that had become her own slow torture. Autumn arrived with its usual pageantry of gold and crimson, the social season resuming as families returned from country estates to London townhouses, and Eleanor had spent the summer months attempting to excise her feelings for the Duke through sheer force of will, filling her days with charitable work and her evenings with books that no longer brought their usual comfort, but the heart proved resistant to reason, and she found herself counting down to the season's opening with equal measures of dread and desperate anticipation. The Duke's courtship of Rosalind resumed with increased seriousness, his visits more frequent and his attention more focused, and society whispered that this would surely be the season of the long-awaited proposal. Yet Eleanor began to notice something new and terrifying, a quality of awareness in his glances that suggested her own feelings might not be entirely unreturned, though she told herself such perception was merely wishful delusion born of her own hopeless attachment. At the theatre one evening, positioned in their box with Rosalind at the front and Eleanor in the customary shadows behind, she felt the weight of observation and looked up to find the Duke's gaze fixed not on her sister, but on herself, his expression unguarded for just a moment, before he seemed to catch himself and redirect his attention to the stage. But Eleanor's hands trembled so violently she had to clasp them together to still them, and the opera might as well have been silence for all she comprehended of it afterward. Her internal turmoil intensified until it became a constant companion, guilt warring with longing, the certainty of her own invisibility battling against these moments that suggested otherwise, and she hated herself for hoping, for allowing even the smallest kernel of possibility to take root when she knew the inevitable conclusion must be Rosalind's triumph and her own continued obscurity. Rosalind, meanwhile, treated the Duke's courtship with casual confidence bordering on indifference, speaking of him in their private moments with the same tone she might use to discuss a well-tailored gown or a satisfactory arrangement of flowers, appreciating his qualities without any evidence of deeper feeling, and Eleanor wondered if she alone noticed this lack of genuine affection, or if love was simply different for people like Rosalind, who had never doubted their own worth. Then came the small moment that nearly undid Eleanor's resolve entirely, a dinner at Hartwick Manor, where conversation turned to literature, and Eleanor mentioned in passing her preference for Shakespeare's sonnets over his plays, finding more truth in compressed emotion than sprawling drama. And 3 days later, a book arrived at the house, a beautiful leather-bound volume of the complete sonnets, with a card that read simply, "For Miss Eleanor Hartwick, who understands the heart of poetry." And though it bore no signature, she knew his hand immediately, and she held that book against her chest in her room and wept for the impossibility of everything. She resolved then to bury her feelings deeper still, to build walls so high and thick that no glance or gesture could penetrate them, to become truly invisible rather than merely overlooked, for the alternative was a slow madness that would destroy her, and she could not, would not, be the cause of disruption to her family's plans or her sister's future, even if that future was with the only man Eleanor had ever loved or would love. And so she practiced indifference like a language until she could meet his eyes without betraying herself, or so she hoped. Rain arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, steady and grey, turning the windows of Hartwick Manor into streaming silver, and driving the afternoon's social gathering into the stuffy confines of the drawing-room where Rosalind held court among admirers, while their mother presided with barely concealed triumph. And Eleanor slipped away as she had perfected the art of doing, seeking refuge in the library, where silence and solitude might provide respite from the performance of enthusiasm she could no longer sustain. The library was her sanctuary, a vast room of dark wood and leather-bound volumes that smelled of paper and pipe smoke and the particular must of old knowledge, and she settled into the window seat with a volume of Keats, watching rain trace patterns down the glass while trying to lose herself in odes to autumn and nightingales. But the words blurred before her eyes, because her mind kept returning to the drawing-room. She had fled. To the Duke's expression when she had excused herself, something almost like disappointment flickering across his features before propriety smoothed it away. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes when the library door opened and closed with careful quietness, and she looked up, expecting the butler or perhaps her father. But it was the Duke who stood there, his dark coat spotted with rain, as though he had stepped outside despite the weather, and their eyes met across the book-lined space with an impact that seemed to still the air between them. "Miss Eleanor," he said, and his voice held a quality she had never heard before, something raw and unguarded. "I apologize for the intrusion. I did not realize anyone had sought refuge here. I merely needed a moment away from—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like a confession, and Eleanor should have risen, should have offered to leave, should have maintained the careful distance she had promised herself, but instead she heard herself say, "The rain makes drawing rooms feel smaller somehow, does it not?" And he smiled then, genuinely smiled, and crossed to the window seat where he asked permission with a gesture before settling at the opposite end. A proper distance maintained, yet somehow more intimate than any conversation they had shared in Rosalind's presence. They spoke of literature at first, the safe territory of books and poetry. But somehow the conversation deepened into philosophy and meaning, the nature of duty versus desire, the weight of expectations, and the cost of living for others' approval. And Eleanor found herself saying things she had never articulated, even to herself, her words tumbling out with an honesty that should have terrified her, and the Duke listened with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and understood, and he spoke of loneliness in crowded rooms and the performance of courtship versus the reality of connection, and they both knew they were no longer discussing abstractions, but something immediate and dangerous, and utterly real. The moment stretched and transformed, charged with everything unsaid, and the Duke leaned forward slightly and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Eleanor, I must tell you." But Rosalind's voice cut through the intimacy like a blade, calling from the hallway, "Has anyone seen the Duke? He seems to have vanished entirely." And Eleanor jerked back as though scalded, the spell broken with devastating completeness, and the Duke stood with visible effort at composure as the door opened and Rosalind appeared, her expression moving from mild annoyance to sharp calculation as she took in the scene, her sister and her suitor alone in the library. And she said with false lightness, "How cozy you both look, but the Duke promised me a game of cards, and I mean to collect." And Eleanor watched the Duke's expression shutter closed, watched him assume the role of dutiful suitor as he offered Rosalind his arm. But before he left, he glanced back at Eleanor, and she saw such conflict in his eyes, such barely restrained longing, that she pressed her hand against her chest, as though she could physically contain the breaking of her heart, and when they were gone, she remained frozen in the window seat, while rain continued its relentless descent, and she understood with perfect clarity that she could not survive many more such moments, that she must create distance before the truth became visible to everyone, before her feelings destroyed not only herself, but the careful architecture of her family's future. Winter descended upon London with crystalline beauty, the social calendar blooming into a relentless succession of festivities that Eleanor could not escape without drawing unwanted attention, Christmas balls and New Year celebrations, and Twelfth Night masquerades that glittered with candlelight and rang with forced gaiety, and she attended them all with a smile fixed so firmly upon her face that her cheeks ached from the performance, while internally she constructed elaborate strategies to avoid proximity to the Duke, positioning herself always in crowds or near chaperones, or engaged in conversations she could not politely abandon. Yet he seemed to possess an uncanny ability to circumvent every defense she erected, appearing at her elbow during refreshments, or requesting introductions to her charitable acquaintances, or simply standing near enough that she felt the heat of his presence like a physical touch. The inevitable collision came at the Rothmore Ball in mid-January, when social obligation and her mother's pointed insistence forced Eleanor to accept the Duke's request for a waltz, and as his hand settled at her waist and hers came to rest upon his shoulder, she felt the 3 weeks of careful avoidance shatter into irrelevance, and the physical awareness between them so intense that she wondered how the entire ballroom could not perceive it, the electricity that seemed to arc through the proper distance between their bodies, and they moved through the steps with a synchronicity that felt like confession, their bodies speaking truths their words could never acknowledge. "You have been avoiding me," he said quietly as they turned, his voice pitched for her ears alone, and Eleanor kept her gaze fixed somewhere beyond his shoulder as she replied with forced lightness, "I cannot imagine what would give you such an impression, Your Grace." But he tightened his grip fractionally and said, "Eleanor, please, do not dissemble. Not with me, not after," and she cut him off with desperate urgency, whispering, "We cannot speak of it. We must not. There is nothing to be said that would not make everything infinitely worse." And his jaw tightened with frustration, but he fell silent, and they completed the waltz in loaded quiet, broken only by the music and the whisper of her skirts against his legs. Meanwhile, Rosalind floated through the season in a haze of confident anticipation, speaking endlessly of wedding plans that existed only in her imagination, selecting china patterns and discussing guest lists, and describing in elaborate detail the improvements she would make to the Duke's various properties once she was installed as their mistress. And Eleanor listened to these monologues with a sick feeling in her stomach, because she could hear in her sister's voice no genuine affection for the man himself, only pleasure in the acquisition of his title and estates and social position. Yet who was she to judge when her own feelings were so hopelessly inappropriate, and her continued presence such a betrayal of sisterly duty? Her mother noticed Eleanor's distress one evening after a particularly trying musicale, finding her daughter pale and trembling in the retiring room, and with uncharacteristic gentleness drew her aside and said, "I know it is difficult, dearest, watching your sister claim such a prize when your own prospects are so modest. But you must remember that we each have our role to play, and yours is to support Rosalind in her triumph, not to indulge in envy or resentment." And the fundamental misunderstanding of Eleanor's suffering was so complete, so devastating in its wrongness, and that she could only nod mutely while something inside her crumbled further. And that night she renewed her determination to sacrifice every feeling at the altar of family duty, to become the invisible support her mother believed her to be, even if it meant slowly erasing herself in the process. Spring returned to London with almost offensive beauty, daffodils and cherry blossoms bursting forth, as though nature itself conspired to mock Eleanor's internal desolation, and the social season resumed with renewed intensity, because everyone from the highest duchess to the lowest scullery maid knew that this would be the moment when the Duke of Ashford finally claimed Rosalind Hartwick as his bride, the extended courtship having built anticipation to an almost unbearable pitch, and the Hartwick household hummed with barely suppressed excitement as invitations flooded in, for what society assumed would be celebratory events marking the imminent engagement. The grand ball at Devonshire House arrived on a perfect May evening, the sort of night that seemed designed for romance and declarations, and Eleanor, dressed with mechanical precision in a gown of pale green silk that her mother had selected because it would not outshine Rosalind's magnificent rose confection, and she descended the stairs to find her sister radiant with confidence and triumph, already rehearsing her modest acceptance speech for the proposal everyone expected within hours, and their mother's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a campaign successfully executed, while their father cleared his throat repeatedly in the manner of men uncomfortable with emotion, but pleased with advantageous matches. Eleanor took her customary position at the edge of the ballroom when they arrived, a chair partially obscured by a potted palm where she could observe without being observed, and she watched the Duke's entrance with the same aching attention she had devoted to him for nearly 2 years, noting how his gaze swept the room and seemed to catch and hold on her position before duty drew him toward Rosalind, and the evening unfolded with agonizing slowness as he danced the requisite dances and made the expected conversation, while the assembled guests waited with breathless anticipation for the moment when he would lead Rosalind somewhere private and return with the announcement that would seal both their fates. But something was wrong. Eleanor could sense it in the tension of his shoulders and the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, and several times she caught him looking not at Rosalind, but around the room as though searching for something, and when his gaze finally found Eleanor in her palm-shadowed corner, the impact was so intense that she physically flinched, and she saw in his expression a desperate question, a plea, a confession of such raw longing that she could barely breathe. And then he was moving not toward the terrace where private proposals traditionally occurred, but directly toward her, cutting through the crowd with single-minded purpose, while conversations stuttered into silence and every eye in the ballroom tracked his progress. Eleanor stood frozen as he approached, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might shatter her ribs, and she could see Rosalind's face across the room, transforming from confusion to realization to something like rage, and her mother's expression of absolute horror and the ripple of shock spreading through society's most elite gathering. And in that crystalline moment, Eleanor made the choice that would haunt her for months to come, because she could not, would not, be the cause of her sister's public humiliation, no matter what it cost her own heart. She stepped forward to meet the Duke, but instead of acknowledging his clear intention, she turned her movement into a graceful gesture toward Rosalind, and said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Your Grace, I believe my sister has been hoping for a turn about the terrace. The evening is so lovely," and she mentioned wanting to see Lady Devonshire's new roses, and she watched something die in his eyes, even as social obligation forced him to redirect his trajectory, to offer his arm to Rosalind instead, to play out the scene everyone expected, and Eleanor sat back down with trembling legs, while the Duke and Rosalind disappeared onto the terrace, and the ballroom held its collective breath. But the proposal did not come. The minutes stretched into a quarter hour and then longer, and when the Duke and Rosalind finally returned, she was smiling with brittle brightness, and he looked like a man condemned, and he made his excuses with impeccable courtesy, and left Devonshire House without the announcement anyone expected. And the whispers began immediately, speculative and cruel, wondering what had passed between them on that terrace, why the Duke had hesitated at this final moment, whether perhaps the beautiful Miss Hartwick had some hidden flaw that had finally revealed itself, and Eleanor watched her sister's mortification transform into defensive pride, while she herself sat in her shadowed corner, and knew with perfect clarity that she had just sacrificed everything for a duty that was destroying them, and all, that her active encouragement of a match built on falsehood and social expectation rather than genuine feeling had only prolonged an agony that must eventually reach its breaking point, and she had never felt more lost, or more alone, or more certain that she had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The Duke's departure from London 3 days after the Devonshire ball arrived with such abruptness that society barely had time to register his absence before he was gone. His townhouse shuttered, and his staff dispatched to his country estate in Derbyshire, with instructions that suggested an extended retreat from the social whirl, and the void he left behind seemed to intensify rather than diminish the speculation about what had transpired on that fateful terrace, whispers growing more elaborate and cruel with each retelling, until Rosalind could barely show her face at afternoon calls, without facing thinly veiled questions and sympathetic looks that felt more like daggers. Eleanor watched her sister oscillate between fury and bewilderment, raging one moment about the Duke's inexplicable behavior and dissolving into anxious tears the next, as she wondered what she had done wrong and what flaw he had perceived that made him withdraw at the very moment when commitment seemed certain, and Eleanor could offer no comfort because any explanation would require confessions she could never make, so she simply held Rosalind's hand and murmured meaningless reassurances while her own heart felt like lead in her chest. Summer settled over London with oppressive heat that drove most of society to their country estates, and the Hartwicks retreated to their modest holdings in Kent, where Eleanor threw herself into the familiar routines of rural life with desperate intensity, tending the gardens and visiting tenant families, and losing herself in books from the library that she read without comprehension, the words sliding across her vision while her mind replayed endlessly that moment when the Duke had walked toward her with such purpose and she had turned him away, and she told herself again and again that she had done the right thing, the only thing, even as the certainty felt increasingly hollow. The letter arrived in mid-July on an afternoon so hot that the air seemed to shimmer, delivered by special messenger in a manner that suggested its importance, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the ducal seal and unfolded the thick paper to find the Duke's familiar script covering both sides of the page. The content ostensibly innocent, a description of improvements he was making to his Derbyshire estate, and inquiries about a botanical text she had mentioned months ago during one of their brief conversations. Yet beneath the proper surface, she could feel the weight of everything unspoken, the careful selection of details that seemed designed to tell her he was thinking of her, remembering their shared moments, holding fast to connections that should have dissolved with distance. Eleanor sat in her bedroom for 3 days debating whether to respond at all, drafting letter after letter that she immediately burned in her fireplace, some too revealing in their warmth, and others so coldly formal that they felt like cruelty, and she cycled through shame at her hesitation and desperate longing to maintain even this tenuous thread of connection and fear that any response would only prolong an impossible situation, until finally she composed a brief note of impeccable propriety that acknowledged his letter and answered his botanical question with scholarly precision while revealing nothing of the chaos in her heart. His return letter came within a fortnight, longer than the first and less carefully restrained, describing not just estate matters, but his thoughts on a book of poetry they had once discussed, and his observations of the Derbyshire landscape in terms that seemed designed to paint pictures for her specifically, and he mentioned in passing that he found himself thinking often of conversations left unfinished and questions left unasked, and Eleanor read these words with tears streaming down her face, because she understood what he was saying beneath the proper language, that he was waiting, that he had not forgotten, that despite everything, the pull between them had not diminished with separation, but had instead crystallized into something that felt increasingly inevitable, and for the first time since that terrible night at Devonshire House, she allowed herself to feel the smallest flicker of hope, even as her loyalty to Rosalind and her family warred with the desperate yearning of her own heart. Autumn arrived in London with a crispness that seemed to sharpen everything, the edges of buildings appearing more defined against skies of impossible blue, and the social season opened with heightened anticipation because the Duke of Ashford had returned after his summer retreat, and society watched with avid curiosity to see how he would navigate the complicated situation he had created, whether he would finally propose to Rosalind Hartwick, or whether the extended courtship would dissolve entirely into scandal and speculation. Eleanor felt her stomach clench when she first saw him across Lady Pemberton's drawing room, noting immediately that something fundamental had shifted in his bearing during the months of separation, a new determination in the set of his shoulders and a directness in his gaze that suggested he had reached some internal resolution, and when his eyes found hers, the impact was so immediate and powerful that she had to grip the arm of her chair to steady herself, and she watched as he made the requisite greetings to Rosalind with impeccable courtesy that somehow felt hollow, performative, as though he were an actor reciting lines from a play whose ending he already knew and resented. The weeks that followed established a pattern that felt increasingly dangerous, the Duke maintaining the outward forms of courting Rosalind while creating opportunities to speak with Eleanor that seemed innocent enough individually but accumulated into something that could not be mistaken for mere politeness, and Eleanor found herself walking in the gardens of various estates with him, ostensibly as Rosalind's chaperone, while her sister entertained other guests. Found herself standing beside him at museum exhibitions, discussing art and philosophy, while Rosalind grew bored and wandered away. Found herself sharing charged glances across ballrooms and dinner tables with an intensity that surely must be visible to anyone who cared to look. And people were looking, Eleanor realized with growing alarm as she overheard whispers at afternoon calls and noticed the speculative glances directed her way. Society's keen observers beginning to notice what had perhaps always been there, but was now approaching undeniable visibility. The way the Duke's attention seemed to seek Eleanor, even when propriety demanded he focus on Rosalind, the way his entire posture changed when Eleanor entered a room, the way conversations between them carried an electric charge that was absent from his interactions with her sister. Rosalind remained supremely confident despite the whispers, treating Eleanor with a condescension that had sharpened into something approaching cruelty, making casual remarks about Eleanor's plainness and scholarly tendencies in company, as though her younger sister's differences were amusing character quirks rather than fundamental aspects of her being. And one afternoon in their shared sitting room, she turned to Eleanor with eyes that glittered with something Eleanor could not quite name, and said with devastating casualness, "You should not harbor foolish hopes about a man so far above your station, dear sister. The Duke may enjoy discussing your dusty books with you, but he would never consider someone so ordinary as a wife." And Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, years of patient acceptance and careful self-denial suddenly giving way to a fury she had never allowed herself to feel, and she stood with trembling hands and said in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Perhaps, Rosalind, you should consider whether a man who finds intellectual conversation threatening is truly the husband you desire." And she walked from the room, leaving her sister staring after her in shocked silence, while Eleanor's heart, hammered with the recognition that she had finally, after nearly 3 years of silent suffering, allowed herself to speak a truth that could not be taken back. The charitable event at St. Catherine's Hospital occupied Eleanor's attention completely on a crisp October afternoon. Her organizational skills deployed in coordinating donations and managing volunteers with an efficiency that came from genuine care rather than social obligation, and she moved through the wards, speaking with patients and overseeing the distribution of blankets and provisions with a focus that allowed her, temporarily, to forget the impossible tangle of her personal life, the way her heart seemed to exist in a constant state of conflict between duty and desire, and between what she owed her family and what she could no longer deny she felt. The Duke arrived mid-afternoon with a substantial contribution that drew murmurs of appreciation from the hospital trustees, but Eleanor noticed immediately that his attention was not on the accolades but on her, his gaze following her movements through the ward as she knelt beside a young mother to adjust an infant's blanket and spoke with elderly patients who had no family to visit them, and she felt the weight of his observation like a physical touch, even as she determinedly did not look in his direction, focusing instead on the work that always made her feel most herself, most valuable beyond the narrow confines of beauty and marriageability that society used to measure a woman's worth. Rosalind had arrived with their mother earlier, but had already retreated to the trustees' salon after a brief and obviously perfunctory walk through the wards, her discomfort with illness and poverty evident in every carefully maintained distance from the patients, her contribution to the charity consisting entirely of her presence, and a few prettily worded sentiments that meant nothing beyond their surface pleasantness. And Eleanor watched the contrast with a clarity that felt almost cruel, understanding for perhaps the first time that the differences between herself and her sister ran deeper than mere appearance, that they were fundamentally different in the things they valued and the ways they moved through the world. The Duke found her in the hospital's small garden, where she had stepped out for a moment of air after hours of close work indoors, the autumn light slanting golden through the leaves of the single oak tree that dominated the space, and he approached with a directness that suggested he had been waiting for precisely this moment of privacy, his expression carrying such intensity that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, even as she told herself she should not be alone with him like this, that every moment they spent together only made the impossible situation more painful. "I have watched you today," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent, "and I have seen what I have always known, that you possess a compassion and capability that transforms everything you touch, that you do not simply perform charity as a social obligation, but engage with it as though every person you encounter matters fundamentally, as though their suffering is your own." And Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at hearing herself seen so clearly, at having someone recognize the part of herself she valued most and had always felt went unnoticed in a world that cared only for the exterior. "Your Grace, you should not speak to me this way," she whispered, even as everything in her wanted to step closer, to close the distance between them and surrender to the pull that had been building for 3 endless years. "I am not the woman you are courting. I am not the future you have been building, and I will not be the cause of my sister's heartbreak, the source of scandal that ruins my family's reputation." But even as she spoke the words, her voice broke on them, revealing the cost of this noble restraint, the way it was slowly destroying her from the inside. "And what of yours?" he asked, and the question hung between them like a challenge and a plea. "What of your heartbreak, Eleanor? What of the way I see you diminish yourself year after year, accepting invisibility as though it were your deserved portion, when in truth you shine brighter than anyone I have ever known? What of the fact that every moment I spend maintaining this charade with your sister feels like a betrayal of everything true and real that exists between us?" His use of her given name, intimate and forbidden, sent a shock through her entire body, and Eleanor found herself unable to maintain the distance she had so carefully constructed, the words tumbling from her in a rush of desperate honesty she had never permitted herself before. "You ask what of my heartbreak, as though you do not know, as though you have not watched me break piece by piece for 3 years while you courted my sister, as though I have not spent countless nights wondering what flaw in myself made me unworthy of the regard you showed her, as though I have not memorized every moment we have shared and replayed them endlessly in the prison of my own mind." And she was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 3 years of repressed feeling finally found voice. "But my heartbreak does not matter, cannot matter, because I am the second daughter, the plain sister, the one who was never supposed to hope for anything beyond a practical match with a country gentleman, and I will not destroy Rosalind's happiness for my own impossible desires. I will not be that selfish, that cruel." The Duke stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers but stopping just short of actual contact, trembling in the air between them, as though he too recognized that to touch would be to cross a line from which there could be no return, and his voice when he spoke carried such anguish that Eleanor felt it resonate in her own chest. "Then tell me what to do," he said, "because I cannot continue this performance much longer. I cannot keep pretending that my heart has not chosen you from almost the first moment I saw you, that every conversation with your sister does not feel like a hollow echo of what I experience when I speak with you. Tell me how to either commit fully to a marriage that would be a lie, or how to release us all from this torment without causing the very devastation we both wish to avoid." And Eleanor understood that he was asking her to make the decision that would determine all their futures, placing the burden of choice on her shoulders even as she had no good answer to give. She looked at him through her tears, at this man she had loved in silence for so long, and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down upon her. And finally she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You must either propose to Rosalind and marry her, giving her the life she has planned and releasing me to accept my own fate, or you must end the courtship entirely and leave us both free, but you cannot continue this half-existence that tortures all of us with hope and despair in equal measure, that keeps society speculating, and my sister anxious and my own heart suspended in a torment that grows worse with each passing day." And having spoken these words, she turned and fled before she could see his response, before she could watch him make a choice that she feared, in her deepest heart, would break her completely regardless of which path he chose. The winter ball at Ashworth House arrived draped in crystalline splendor, chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors, while the cream of London society gathered in their finest silks and jewels, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, because everyone knew, with the certainty that comes from months of observation and speculation, that tonight the Duke of Ashford would finally propose to Rosalind Hartwick and end the longest courtship in recent memory, though the whispers in corners suggested complications that the main actors seemed determined to ignore. Eleanor had dressed with particular care, a perverse impulse to look her best on the night she would watch her heart's desire pledge himself irrevocably to another. Her gown, a deep sapphire that made her eyes luminous, even as she felt hollow inside. Preparing herself for the final breaking that she knew must come in the moment when theoretical loss would transform into concrete reality, and she would have to find some way to continue existing in a world where he belonged completely to her sister. The Duke arrived fashionably late, looking severe and magnificent in black evening dress, and Eleanor watched from her position near the potted palms as he made his greetings to the host and hostess, as his eyes swept the ballroom in what appeared to be a search, until they found and held hers for one endless moment before he turned deliberately toward where Rosalind held court among her admirers, and Eleanor felt something twist painfully in her chest at that visible choosing, that deliberate selection of duty over the current that still pulled between them with undeniable force. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness through dinner and dancing, through meaningless conversations and forced smiles, until finally the orchestra began the final waltz, and the Duke crossed the ballroom with purposeful strides to request Rosalind's hand, and Eleanor watched her sister's face transform with triumphant certainty, watched her place her gloved hand in his with the confidence of a woman who knew herself about to receive everything she had planned and expected, and Eleanor felt her own hands clench in her lap as she prepared to witness the death of hope she had never fully allowed herself to feel. They were beautiful together, Eleanor forced herself to acknowledge as they swept across the floor, Rosalind's golden beauty complementing his dark elegance, and she could see the guests beginning to position themselves strategically, understanding that the proposal would come immediately following the dance, wanting to witness the moment that would be discussed in drawing rooms for months to come, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away despite the pain, watching with a terrible focus as the music swelled toward its conclusion and the Duke led Rosalind through the final turns. The waltz ended and time seemed to suspend itself as the Duke escorted Rosalind, not toward a private alcove as might be expected, but directly to where Lord Hartwick stood near the refreshment tables, and the crowd parted before them like water before a ship's bow, absolute silence falling across the ballroom as society collectively held its breath, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering so violently she thought it might be visible through the silk of her gown, as she watched the Duke bow formally to her father and request a private word, and Lord Hartwick nodded with barely suppressed satisfaction, while Rosalind's smile grew radiant with certainty. But then the Duke spoke, his voice carrying in the silence with devastating clarity, words that shattered expectation like crystal striking stone, as he said with impeccable courtesy and visible strain, "Lord Hartwick, I must beg your forgiveness and ask for additional time to consider the serious step of matrimony, as I find I cannot in good conscience proceed without further reflection on whether I can offer your daughter the devotion she deserves." And the ballroom erupted in shocked whispers, while Rosalind's face transformed from triumph to humiliation in the space of a heartbeat, her complexion draining to white and then flooding with mortified crimson, as she stood exposed before all of society as the woman who had been courted for 3 years without securing a proposal. Eleanor watched in horror as her sister swayed slightly, saw their mother's face contort with fury and their father's expression harden with outrage, and she moved without conscious thought, crossing the ballroom to Rosalind's side and placing a steady arm around her sister's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort while guiding her toward the retiring room as the crowd pressed closer with avid curiosity, and in the chaos she felt, rather than saw the Duke's gaze follow her progress, felt the weight of his tortured attention as she chose once again to support her sister, even as her own world collapsed into confusion and desperate, treacherous hope that she immediately crushed, because how could she allow herself to feel anything but grief when Rosalind had just been publicly devastated in front of everyone who mattered? The Hartwick household descended into chaos in the days following the ball, the drawing room becoming a theatre of recrimination and wounded pride as Rosalind alternated between tearful devastation and volcanic rage. Her humiliation made worse by the knowledge that all of London society had witnessed her public rejection, and their mother paced the carpets with barely contained fury, alternating between comforting her elder daughter and plotting social revenge against the Duke, who had dared to treat a Hartwick with such disrespect after 3 years of accepted courtship. Eleanor found herself in an impossible position, caught between her genuine sympathy for Rosalind's pain and a treacherous awareness that she could not bring herself to condemn the Duke as thoroughly as her family expected, and when she attempted to offer comfort to her sister, she found herself rebuffed with a cruelty born of suffering, Rosalind turning on her with accusations that perhaps Eleanor had somehow encouraged the Duke's hesitation, that her constant presence as chaperone had created some unfortunate impression, and though the words were spoken in grief rather than genuine belief, they struck Eleanor like physical blows, because was there not some terrible truth in them? Had she not allowed her feelings to show in glances and moments she thought were private? Their father took a more pragmatic approach to the crisis, his primary concern being the family's reputation and whether the Duke's public uncertainty would damage Rosalind's prospects with other suitors, and he spent hours in his study composing carefully worded letters to influential friends attempting to control the narrative, to frame the situation as the Duke's own inadequacy rather than any failing on Rosalind's part. While society's gossip reached cruel and inventive heights, with speculation ranging from secret scandals to questions about Rosalind's virtue that made Eleanor's blood boil with protective anger, even as she understood that such whispers were the inevitable consequence of such a public spectacle. The message arrived on the third day after the ball, delivered by the Duke's footman to the Hartwick butler, with instructions that it be given directly to Miss Eleanor Hartwick, and the household erupted in fresh outrage at this impropriety, their mother declaring it unconscionable that the Duke should attempt to communicate privately with the younger sister of the woman he had just humiliated, their father's face darkening with suspicion as he demanded to know what possible reason the Duke could have for such contact, and even Rosalind emerged from her chambers to stare at Eleanor with red-rimmed eyes that held something uncomfortably close to accusation. Eleanor stood in the center of the drawing-room with the sealed letter burning in her hand like a brand, feeling the weight of her family's scrutiny and expectations, knowing that whatever the message contained it held the power to either condemn her completely or offer some explanation for the incomprehensible events of the ball, and she found herself paralyzed by competing impulses to tear it open immediately and to throw it unopened into the fire rather than face what truths it might reveal. The guilt that had been building in her chest for 3 years crystallized into something sharp and overwhelming as she looked at her sister's devastated face and understood with terrible clarity that regardless of what she had or had not done, regardless of whether her feelings had been truly invisible or had somehow communicated themselves to the Duke, she had become complicit in Rosalind's pain simply by existing, by being present, by failing to remove herself entirely from situations where her treacherous heart might betray her. With hands that trembled visibly, Eleanor set the unopened letter on the drawing-room table and spoke in a voice that barely qualified as steady, informing her family that she would not read private correspondence from the Duke under these circumstances, that propriety and loyalty to her sister demanded she refuse any communication that had not been extended to the family as a whole, and she watched her mother's face register surprise and grudging approval, while Rosalind's expression shifted into something Eleanor could not quite read, and their father nodded with grim satisfaction before taking the letter himself and consigning it to the flames of the drawing-room fire, where it curled and blackened into ash, carrying whatever words the Duke had written into oblivion, and Eleanor felt something inside herself break as she watched those unread sentences disappear, understanding that she had just closed a door that might never open again, but unable to see any other choice that would not make her the villain in her sister's tragedy. The Duke departed London 3 days after the disastrous ball, his sudden withdrawal to his northern estates, sending fresh waves of speculation through society's drawing rooms, and the weeks that followed stretched into an agonizing void of silence, where Eleanor found herself suspended between catastrophes, watching as Rosalind's initial devastation gradually transformed into a pride-fueled anger that felt somehow healthier than the tears, but no less difficult to witness. Her sister's fury directed not at Eleanor, but at the Duke, who had wasted 3 years of her life and made her the subject of pitying whispers and knowing glances wherever she appeared in public. Eleanor's own suffering intensified in the absence of any word from him, the silence more painful than his presence had ever been, because at least when she could see him she knew he existed in the same world she inhabited, whereas now he seemed to have vanished into some unreachable distance, and she was left with nothing but the memory of his tortured expression as she had guided Rosalind away from the ballroom and the haunting question of what his burned letter might have contained, what explanations or confessions had turned to ash before she could read them, and she found herself caught in an impossible position where she had lost both her sister's complete trust, for Rosalind sometimes looked at her with a confusion that suggested uncomfortable thoughts were forming, and any chance she might have had with the Duke, for surely her refusal to read his message had communicated a rejection as clear as words could have done. The days became a blur of forced normalcy, where Eleanor attempted to maintain her usual routines while feeling as though some essential part of herself had been hollowed out and replaced with numbness, and she retreated into the solitary pursuits that had always been her refuge, spending hours in the Hartwick Library surrounded by books whose words she could not seem to absorb, walking the winter-bare gardens until her hands went numb with cold, and sitting alone in her chamber, staring at nothing, while her mind circled endlessly around the same unanswerable questions about what she should have done differently and whether there had ever been any path that would not have led to pain. A particularly dark evening found her standing at her chamber window, watching sleet strike the glass in the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the bleakness of her internal landscape, and she allowed herself for the first time to fully acknowledge the depth of her despair, to admit that she had not merely lost a possibility but had lost the only man she had ever loved or likely ever would love, and the future stretched before her as an endless succession of years where she would smile and be dutiful and watch from the periphery as others found happiness, while she remained forever the overlooked second daughter who had briefly touched something extraordinary before it slipped through her fingers like water. And in that moment she understood with terrible clarity that she had become a ghost haunting her own life, visible but not truly present, speaking and moving through the expected patterns, while her actual self remained locked away in a place no one could reach. The knock at the door came on a February afternoon, when the household had settled into a grim routine of pretending normalcy, and when the butler announced that the Duchess of Thornbury requested an audience with Miss Eleanor Hartwick. The entire family reacted with confusion because the Duke's elder sister had never called upon them before, her position in society being such that the Hartwicks were beneath her usual notice, and Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest as she descended to the drawing-room, where an elegant woman with the Duke's dark eyes waited with an expression that suggested purposes beyond a mere social call. The Duchess studied Eleanor with an intensity that felt almost invasive before dismissing the hovering servants with a gesture that brooked no argument, and when they were alone, she spoke with a directness that bypassed all conventional pleasantries, informing Eleanor that her brother had withdrawn to Ashford Hall in a state that alarmed his family, that he spent his days riding the estate boundaries in all weather, and his nights in the library staring at books he did not read, saying that he had lost weight and sleep, and seemed to be punishing himself for sins the Duchess could not fully comprehend, but suspected had something to do with the Hartwick family and the disaster of the winter ball. Eleanor listened with a heart that hammered painfully against her ribs as the Duchess described the Duke's suffering in clinical terms that somehow made it more rather than less devastating, and when she finally found her voice to ask why the Duchess was telling her these things, the elegant woman smiled with something that might have been sadness or sympathy or understanding, and said only that sometimes the people most affected by a situation were the last to see the truth of it clearly, that the Duchess had observed her brother for 3 years and knew him well enough to recognize the difference between duty and desire, and that Eleanor might wish to consider what her own heart told her about where the Duke's true affections had always resided, cryptic words that left Eleanor trembling with a dangerous hope she did not dare fully embrace but could not entirely suppress. Spring arrived with an insistence that felt almost cruel in its renewal. The London season, commencing with its usual pageantry of balls and garden parties and afternoon calls, but this year, the Duke of Ashford's conspicuous absence created a void that society initially found scandalous and then gradually accepted as the new normal. Conversations, shifting from speculation about when he would return to discussions of other eligible gentlemen and other romantic entanglements, and Eleanor found herself observing these social machinations with a detachment born of her winter's suffering, watching as Rosalind emerged from her chambers with a new animation that had nothing to do with the Duke and everything to do with Lord Pemberton, a charming viscount with an easy laugh and uncomplicated affections, who had begun calling with increasing frequency, and whose attentions Rosalind received with a warmth Eleanor had never witnessed during the Duke's 3-year courtship. Eleanor studied her sister across the drawing room as Lord Pemberton recounted some amusing anecdote that made Rosalind's eyes light with genuine delight, and she recognized with startling clarity that this was what authentic attraction looked like: the unconscious, leaning forward when he spoke, the quick flush of pleasure at his compliments. The way Rosalind's practiced social grace gave way to something more spontaneous and real, and Eleanor understood with a relief so profound it left her momentarily breathless that her sister had never truly loved the Duke at all, had been attracted to the prestige of his title and the triumph of securing society's most sought-after bachelor, but had never experienced the soul-deep connection that Eleanor had foolishly believed was forming between them. The realization shifted something fundamental in Eleanor's understanding of the past 3 years, allowing her to see that while she had been torturing herself with guilt over her feelings for a man her sister supposedly loved, Rosalind had been performing the role of devoted beloved without ever engaging her actual heart, and though this knowledge did not erase Eleanor's suffering or make her choices different, it did ease the crushing weight of guilt that had made her refuse the Duke's letter and resign herself to a future of lonely invisibility, permitting her to acknowledge for the first time without immediate self-recrimination that what she felt for the Duke was real and deep and worth something, even if it never came to fruition. She began allowing herself small permissions in the weeks that followed, not seeking him out, for he remained absent from London but no longer actively suppressing every memory and feeling associated with him, permitting herself to recall the library conversation without drowning in guilt, to remember his expression during their waltz without immediately castigating herself for the feelings it evoked, and she discovered that this acceptance brought a quiet confidence she had never possessed before, a sense that perhaps she was worthy of being seen and chosen and loved not because of beauty or accomplishment, but because of the essential truth of who she was beneath the role of overlooked second daughter. The bookshop encounter happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when Eleanor had slipped away from the household to browse the latest arrivals at Hatchard's. Her arms already laden with 3 volumes, she could not resist when she rounded the corner of the poetry section and collided directly with a solid form that she recognized before she even looked up, her body responding to his presence with an awareness that 3 months of separation had done nothing to diminish, and she found herself staring up into the Duke's face, seeing shock mirror her own as they stood frozen in the narrow aisle with dropped books scattered around their feet and all the careful defenses she had constructed crumbling in an instant. He looked thinner than she remembered, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting sleep as elusive for him as it had been for her, but his gaze as it held hers contained a intensity that made her breath catch, and her carefully maintained composure threatened to shatter completely, and they stood in silence that stretched beyond comfortable into something charged and painful until propriety reasserted itself, and they both bent simultaneously to retrieve the fallen volumes, their hands brushing as they reached for the same book, sending electricity through Eleanor's entire body, that she knew he must have felt as well from the way his breath hitched and his fingers lingered against hers for one impossible moment before they both withdrew. The exchange of pleasantries that followed felt absurd, given the depths of feeling swirling beneath the surface, Eleanor inquiring after his health in a voice that trembled despite her best efforts, while he responded with equal formality, though his eyes never left her face. And she was desperately aware that they were in public with other patrons nearby, and that any extended conversation would fuel exactly the kind of gossip that had made the winter so unbearable, yet she found herself unable to simply walk away, rooted to the spot by the terrible hunger to know why he had returned to London now, and what he intended, and whether the suffering she read in his face matched her own. But before either could speak beyond the required courtesies, the shop owner appeared to assist them, and the moment fractured, leaving Eleanor to gather her books and depart with a brief curtsy, while the Duke stood watching her retreat with an expression that haunted her dreams for weeks afterward. And she understood as she stepped into the London afternoon, with her heart racing and her hands shaking, that whatever resolution awaited them, it was approaching with the inevitability of spring following winter, ready or not. Lord Pemberton's courtship of Rosalind progressed with a swiftness that shocked those who had witnessed the Duke's 3-year hesitation, the charming Viscount calling daily at the Hartwick residence, with flowers and poetry, and an easy attentiveness that made Rosalind bloom in ways Eleanor had never observed during the long years of being courted by a duke. And within 3 weeks of their first proper conversation at Lady Marchmont's musicale, the entire household recognized that something genuine was forming between them, something uncomplicated by duty or expectation or the weight of social positioning that had characterized Rosalind's previous romantic entanglement. Eleanor found herself watching her sister with a mixture of relief and fascination as Rosalind laughed at Lord Pemberton's jests with unaffected delight, blushed at his compliments with real pleasure rather than practiced coquetry, and spoke of him in private with an animation that revealed depths of feeling she had never exhibited when discussing the Duke, and the contrast illuminated truths Eleanor had suspected, but never quite allowed herself to fully acknowledge about the nature of her sister's 3-year performance as devoted beloved to a man she had never actually loved, beyond his title and consequence. The Hartwick parents received Lord Pemberton's suit with an approval that bordered on gratitude, for while a viscount's rank fell below a duke's, the family's reputation had been sufficiently damaged by the winter's scandal that securing any respectable match for Rosalind felt like a victory, and Eleanor sensed her mother's relief that at least one daughter would be settled appropriately, even if the other remained a perpetual source of maternal disappointment. Though lately her mother's sighs over Eleanor's unmarried state had grown less frequent, as if she had finally accepted that her second daughter was destined for spinsterhood, and there was no point in continued lamentation. The afternoon when everything shifted between the sisters arrived on an unseasonably warm May day when Eleanor discovered Rosalind alone in the morning room, surrounded by fabric samples and invitation designs for an engagement that had not yet been formally announced, but seemed inevitable given Lord Pemberton's increasing devotion, and Rosalind looked up from her planning with an expression that held none of her usual casual superiority, gesturing for Eleanor to sit beside her with an openness that had been absent from their relationship since childhood, and what followed was perhaps the most honest conversation the sisters had ever shared as adults. Rosalind spoke with a candor that surprised Eleanor, admitting that she had never truly loved the Duke, despite 3 years of accepting his courtship, that she had been dazzled by the prospect of becoming a duchess and had convinced herself that affection would develop once they were married, but that in truth she had found him exhausting with his intensity and his silences, and the way he seemed always to be searching for something she could not identify or provide, and she confessed with something approaching shame that she had been relieved when he withdrew his suit, even through the humiliation of becoming an object of society's pity, because the alternative had been a lifetime of trying to be something she was not for a man she did not understand. Eleanor listened with careful neutrality, offering no comment that might reveal the tumult these admissions created within her own heart. But when Rosalind reached across the space between them to grasp her hand, and said with surprising gentleness that she had observed more than Eleanor perhaps realized during those 3 years, that she had noticed the way the Duke's gaze followed Eleanor through crowded rooms, and the way Eleanor's entire being seemed to orient toward him, even as she tried to remain invisible, Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten what breathing freely felt like. "You could have him if you wanted, sister," Rosalind said with a lightness that somehow made the words more rather than less profound, her smile containing no malice or resentment, but rather a kind of amused understanding. And Eleanor sat frozen in that sun-filled room, while her entire conception of the possible rearranged itself around these casually offered words. The permission she had never imagined receiving landing like a benediction she did not know how to accept. And though she managed some vague deflection about the Duke being long gone from London and unlikely to return, she carried Rosalind's blessing with her like a secret talisman in the days that followed, a gift more valuable than her sister could possibly know. The invitation to Rosalind's engagement ball arrived on cream-colored paper with gilt edging, announcing a celebration of her betrothal to Lord Pemberton. The event scheduled for the first week of June, when London's social season reached its glittering apex, and Eleanor held the elegant card in trembling fingers, knowing with absolute certainty that the Duke would attend for propriety, demanded he demonstrate publicly that he bore no ill will toward the woman who had once expected to become his Duchess, and the prospect of seeing him again in formal circumstances, surrounded by hundreds of observers, filled her with a terror and anticipation so intertwined she could not distinguish where one emotion ended and the other began. She spent the week before the ball in a state of nervous preparation that her lady's maid noticed but diplomatically did not comment upon, selecting and rejecting gowns with an indecisiveness wholly unlike her usual pragmatic approach to dress, finally settling on a silk creation in deep emerald that brought out the green in her hazel eyes and made her skin luminous in ways her typical modest choices never achieved, and she told herself this vanity had nothing to do with the Duke, even as she knew she was lying to herself with every careful instruction about how her hair should be arranged. The evening of the ball arrived with that particular quality of summer twilight that makes everything seem suspended between day and night, possibility and reality, and Eleanor descended the stairs of Rosalind's engagement venue, her parents having spared no expense in securing the magnificent Pemberton House ballroom, with her heart beating so violently she feared it might be visible through the bodice of her gown, and she had barely entered the crowded space when she felt his presence with that uncanny awareness that had plagued her for 3 years, her gaze finding him across the expanse of dancing couples and glittering chandeliers, as if drawn by some invisible thread that connected them, despite all the obstacles and pain and impossible circumstances that should have severed any bond between them. He stood near the terrace doors in evening dress that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the austere perfection of his features, speaking with Lord Pemberton with every appearance of cordiality, though Eleanor noticed the tension in his posture that suggested he was as aware of her presence as she was of his, and then he turned, and their eyes met across the ballroom and everything else. The music, the conversations, the hundreds of people between them simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way, the world narrowing to the space between their locked gazes, where 3 years of longing and suffering and unspoken truth seemed to arc like electricity through the perfumed air. Eleanor forced herself to look away first, turning to accept a glass of champagne from a passing servant, with hands that shook enough to make the crystal tremble, and she moved through the required social niceties of greeting other guests and complimenting Rosalind on the beautiful decorations with half her attention, while the other half remained excruciatingly aware of the Duke's location, the room, tracking his movements with a precision that should have embarrassed her, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. And when he approached her family's group with Lord Pemberton to offer formal congratulations to the engaged couple, Eleanor thought her knees might give way from the force of being in his immediate presence again after months of separation. The exchange of greetings between the Duke and Rosalind held none of the awkwardness Eleanor had feared, her sister receiving his good wishes with genuine warmth, and Lord Pemberton demonstrating the easy confidence of a man secure in his beloved's affections. But when the Duke turned to Eleanor and bowed over her gloved hand with exquisite formality, she felt the brief pressure of his fingers through the silk and knew that he was as affected by this proximity as she was, his voice steady as he murmured the proper pleasantries, but his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch and her composure threaten to shatter completely. She managed some appropriate response, though she could not afterward recall what words she had used, and then he was requesting a dance with her properly, formally, with her mother standing right there as witness, and Eleanor heard herself accepting, even as some distant part of her mind recognized that this was dangerous, that dancing with him would undo all the careful distance she had maintained and expose feelings she had worked so desperately to conceal. But when he led her onto the floor for a waltz and placed his hand at her waist, she understood that concealment was no longer possible or perhaps even desirable, that 3 years of denial had brought them both to this moment where truth could no longer be avoided. The music began, and they moved together with a synchronicity that felt inevitable, their bodies remembering what propriety had forced them to forget during all those careful months of avoiding too much contact, and Eleanor was aware of every point where they touched his hand warm through her glove, his other palm steady at her back, the scant inches between them that society demanded, but that felt like both too much and not nearly enough distance, and when he leaned closer under the pretense of navigating through other couples and whispered, "I have waited long enough," directly into her ear, she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what was possible, the words a declaration and a promise and a plea, all compressed into 4 syllables that resonated through her entire being. "Your Grace," she managed to respond, though her voice emerged breathless and uncertain, and he pulled back just enough to look into her face with an expression that held nothing of the careful neutrality he had maintained in public. For 3 years, his eyes blazing with a barely contained intensity that made her simultaneously want to flee and never move from this spot again. And she realized that whatever happened after this dance, nothing would ever be the same between them, that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there could be no retreat into the comfortable fiction of polite distance. And as the music swelled around them and they turned through the candlelit ballroom, Eleanor felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time since that afternoon in the library, when she had truly understood the depth and impossibility of what she felt for this man, and she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of imagining that perhaps impossible things sometimes found a way to become real after all. The morning after Rosalind's engagement ball arrived with a clarity that seemed to illuminate everything Eleanor had tried to keep hidden in shadow for 3 years, and when the Duke's card was delivered to the Hartwick residence before noon, requesting permission to call that very afternoon, her mother's shock manifested in a series of questions Eleanor could not answer without revealing the truths she was not yet ready to speak aloud, but her father granted permission with a thoughtfulness that suggested he had observed more than Eleanor had credited during the long years of watching his daughters navigate the complexities of courtship and consequence. And when the Duke arrived precisely at the appointed hour, dressed in afternoon attire that somehow made him appear both devastatingly handsome and appropriately formal, Eleanor descended the stairs to the drawing-room with her heart hammering against her ribs and her mind racing through all the possible meanings of this unprecedented visit. He stood when she entered with a correctness that might have seemed cold except for the warmth in his eyes as they met hers, and her mother sat rigid on the settee as chaperone, with an expression that conveyed both disapproval and a reluctant curiosity about what would transpire between the man who had courted one daughter for 3 years and the other daughter, who had always remained so carefully in the background, and the Duke's request to take Eleanor for a proper walk in Hyde Park under the supervision of her maid constituted such a clear declaration of intent that even Mrs. Hartwick could not fabricate a reasonable objection, though her pursed lips suggested she found the entire situation highly irregular and potentially damaging to whatever remained of the family's already compromised reputation. The walk itself felt simultaneously eternal and impossibly brief, as Eleanor moved beside the Duke through the carefully manicured paths of the park, with half of fashionable London observing their progress and undoubtedly speculating about the shocking turn of events that had led the Duke of Ashford to publicly court the overlooked second Hartwick daughter after years of pursuing the beautiful eldest. And Eleanor experienced a peculiar mixture of terror and exhilaration as she felt the weight of society's collective gaze upon them, knowing that this single afternoon's promenade would be discussed in every drawing-room and analyzed in every gossiping circle until the next scandal arrived to displace their story from the position of primary fascination. The Duke seemed entirely unconcerned with the attention they attracted, speaking to Eleanor with a focus and devotion that suggested the rest of the world had ceased to exist beyond the private universe created by their conversation. And when he said quietly that he wished to court her properly and publicly with her family's blessing and society's witness, Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without the constant pressure of suppressed longing crushing her lungs, and she heard herself accept his suit with a steadiness that surprised her, given the way her hands trembled inside her gloves, and her pulse raced with such violence she felt certain he must be able to hear it. He told her then, as they paused beneath an ancient oak that provided a moment of privacy from the most aggressive observers, that he had seen her first that day at the garden party 3 years ago, that his gaze had found her standing at the periphery of the gathering, and something in the quiet intelligence of her expression and the way she observed the world with such careful attention had arrested his notice completely. But when he had approached her family, it was Rosalind who had been presented and expected and impossible to refuse without causing offense, and he had allowed himself to be drawn into a courtship with the wrong sister because he had been young enough and foolish enough to believe that duty and social expectation mattered more than the inexplicable pull he felt toward the woman, who always seemed to be watching him with eyes that saw everything he tried to hide beneath the performance of ducal correctness. Eleanor listened to this confession, with tears threatening to spill from her eyes and ruin the careful composure she had maintained through 3 years of silent suffering, and she understood that they had both been trapped in a cage of propriety and family obligation and fear of causing pain to others, but that the cage door had finally opened, and they were stepping into a future neither had dared to imagine even in their most private moments of desperate hope. And when he asked permission to call upon her again tomorrow and the day after that, and every day until she grew tired of his presence, she laughed through her tears and told him she suspected that day would never arrive, and the smile that transformed his usually austere features into something approaching joy made her believe that perhaps 3 years of waiting had been necessary after all, that some loves required patience and suffering and the slow accumulation of understanding before they could emerge into the light where everyone could see what had always been true for those willing to look closely enough. The weeks that followed the Duke's first official call transformed into a courtship unlike anything Eleanor had imagined during all those years of silent longing. For instead of the careful formality that had characterized his pursuit of Rosalind, this courtship unfolded with an intensity of genuine connection that seemed to compress 3 years of suppressed conversation into every afternoon walk and evening entertainment. And they discovered in each other a hunger to finally speak all the thoughts they had been forced to keep locked away when propriety and family obligation had made honesty impossible. He confessed one afternoon, as they strolled through the British Museum, examining classical sculptures, that he had chosen duty over his heart for far too long, that every time he had called upon Rosalind, he had been acutely aware of Eleanor's presence in the room and had found himself unconsciously directing his comments toward her, rather than the woman he was ostensibly courting, and Eleanor listened with tears threatening to spill as she understood how much suffering they had both endured in their separate prisons of propriety and self-denial. She admitted in turn during a theatre intermission, when they stood slightly apart from the rest of their party, that she had spent 3 years convinced she was invisible to him, that she had watched him court her sister while her own feelings grew from reluctant awareness into something so consuming she had feared it would destroy her if she did not find a way to suppress it completely. And the Duke's hand had tightened on hers with such force that she knew he shared her grief over all the wasted time, even as they both recognized that perhaps the depth of what they felt now existed precisely because they had been forced to wait and observe and understand before they could claim what had always belonged to them. Their conversations ranged across every subject, with the desperate energy of people who had been starved for intellectual companionship, and finally found someone who could match their thoughts. And Eleanor discovered that the Duke possessed not just the serious intensity she had always observed, but also a dry wit and a capacity for playful debate that emerged when he felt safe enough to lower the austere mask he showed to the rest of society, and she found herself laughing with genuine delight during their country walks, when he would challenge her opinions on everything from literature to social reform, with an engagement that made her feel seen and valued in ways she had never experienced before. Society gradually shifted from shocked disapproval to reluctant acceptance, as those who had observed closely during the previous 3 years began to recognize what had always been visible to anyone willing to look beyond the surface of social expectation, and the whispers that had initially suggested scandal transformed into speculation about how the Duke and Eleanor's obvious connection had been overlooked for so long, with several matrons claiming they had always suspected the true direction of his affections, despite all evidence to the contrary. The pivotal moment of complete acceptance came when the Duke invited Eleanor to accompany him to visit the charitable institution she had mentioned supporting, a home for orphaned children that operated on the outskirts of London. And as he watched her interact with the residents with genuine compassion and practical capability that went far beyond the performative charity work most society ladies engaged in, he understood with absolute clarity that this was who she truly was when freed from the constraints of being the overlooked second daughter, and the recognition in his eyes, as she knelt to comfort a crying child, made Eleanor's heart swell with a joy so profound she felt it might lift her entirely off the ground, for she saw reflected back at her the truth that he loved, not some idealized version of who he thought she should be, but rather the complete and complicated reality of who she actually was. Shadows and light together, and that gift of being truly seen and accepted felt more valuable than any title or fortune or social position could ever be. The Duke arranged the proposal with a care that spoke of how long he had been imagining this moment, choosing the walled garden at his London residence during the golden hour, when sunset painted everything in shades of amber and rose, and he ensured their privacy through the simple expedient of inviting Eleanor's parents to dine with him afterward, so that their presence in his home was perfectly proper, while giving him the precious minutes alone with her that propriety would normally deny. And when Eleanor walked into that garden and saw him standing beneath an arch of climbing roses, with the dying light gilding his features into something almost ethereal, she understood that this was the moment when 3 years of waiting and suffering and silent longing would finally transform into something real and acknowledged and permanent. He came to her immediately, taking both her hands in his with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and she saw in his eyes the same mixture of certainty and vulnerability that she felt coursing through her own veins as he began to speak the words he had clearly prepared with such deliberation, telling her that he had spent 3 years making the wrong choice out of duty and fear, and a misguided belief that he could force his heart to follow where society expected rather than where it truly belonged, and his voice broke slightly as he said he should have chosen her from the first moment. He saw her standing at the periphery of that garden party, with intelligence and grace radiating from every careful gesture. Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she gently interrupted him, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, as she told him that perhaps they had needed those 3 years of separation and suffering to truly understand what they had found in each other, that some connections required patience and pain before they could emerge strong enough to withstand the scrutiny and judgment of the world, and she said with quiet conviction that they had not made wrong choices, but rather they had chosen each other when they were finally ready to value authenticity over expectation and love over duty, and the expression of wonder that crossed his face suggested he had never considered that their suffering might have served a purpose beyond mere waste. He knelt then in the traditional posture of proposal, but there was nothing traditional about the words he spoke as he asked her to be his wife and his partner and his truest companion through all the years they had remaining to them, promising to spend the rest of his life ensuring she never felt invisible or overlooked or anything less than cherished. And when Eleanor whispered her acceptance through tears of joy that blurred the garden into an impressionistic painting of color and light, he rose and drew from his pocket a ring that was not the heavy heirloom she had expected, but rather a delicate band set with stones chosen specifically to match the unusual green gold of her eyes. And she understood that even this detail had been considered and planned because he saw her as she truly was, rather than as what tradition dictated she should be. Their first kiss held 3 years of restraint and longing, compressed into a single moment of connection that felt both achingly familiar and thrillingly new. And Eleanor felt something inside her chest that had been clenched tight with fear and self-protection, finally open completely as she allowed herself to believe that she was truly loved, not despite her overlooked status, but because the right person had been willing to look closely enough to see her worth. And when they finally drew apart, he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood breathing the same air in the gathering twilight, while the world beyond the garden walls continued its busy chaos, unaware that something precious and hard-won had just been claimed from the wreckage of duty and expectation. The announcement to both families that evening was received with a happiness that felt universal, despite its complications, for Rosalind embraced Eleanor with genuine warmth and whispered that she had always known Eleanor deserved more than she allowed herself to believe, and their parents expressed a relief that suggested they had observed more of their younger daughter's suffering than Eleanor had realized. And as the Duke kept Eleanor's hand clasped in his throughout the celebration, she felt the peculiar sensation of being visible after years of existing in shadow, of being chosen after years of watching others be selected first, and the joy that flooded through her felt earned in a way that easy happiness never could have been, forged as it was in the fires of patience and sacrifice and the courage it took to finally claim what her heart had always known belonged to her. The suggestion that the two sisters share a double wedding ceremony emerged from Rosalind herself during a fitting for her trousseau, and though Eleanor's initial reaction was hesitation, born from years of being relegated to the background, she saw in her sister's eyes a genuine desire to mark this transformation in their relationship, for the 3 years of suffering had paradoxically created an opportunity for honesty between them that the easy superficiality of their earlier connection had never allowed. And Rosalind admitted with uncharacteristic vulnerability that she wanted Eleanor beside her on what would be the most important day of both their lives, as a way of acknowledging that they had both found their true matches only after wandering through confusion and misplaced expectations. The planning of the joint ceremony revealed the fundamental differences in their natures that had always existed but had been obscured by society's insistence on comparing them, for Rosalind approached the arrangements with enthusiastic attention to spectacle and display, while Eleanor found her joy in the quieter details that spoke of intimacy and personal meaning, and the Duke observed Eleanor's careful selection of flowers that held symbolic significance and music that reflected their shared conversations with an expression of such tender recognition that she felt her heart might overflow with the simple pleasure of being understood so completely. The weeks of preparation transformed into a peculiar form of making up for lost time, as the Duke found excuses to be present for nearly every decision and consultation, and Eleanor teased him gently about his sudden interest in the minutiae of wedding breakfast menus and seating arrangements, until he confessed that he had spent 3 years denied the right to court her properly, and he would not surrender a single moment of this precious time when he could finally claim his place at her side without subterfuge or guilt. Rosalind's genuine happiness for Eleanor manifested in unexpected moments of sisterly affection, and one afternoon, as they reviewed fabric samples together, she reached across the table to grasp Eleanor's hand and said with quiet intensity that Eleanor had always deserved more than she believed herself worthy of receiving, that their mother's unconscious favoritism and society's shallow values had convinced Eleanor she existed only to support others, when the truth was that she possessed a strength and depth that Rosalind had always secretly envied, even as she had taken her privileged position for granted. The night before the wedding, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with a mixture of anticipation and the peculiar grief that accompanies the ending of one chapter, even when the next promises greater happiness, and when a servant delivered a sealed letter from the Duke with instructions that she read it before retiring. She broke the wax with trembling fingers and discovered words that captured everything they had been to each other and everything they would become, a promise written in his precise hand that tomorrow would mark not an ending of their unconventional courtship, but rather the beginning of a partnership built on the foundation of genuine recognition and hard-won understanding. And she penned her own response through tears of joy that blurred the ink slightly, as she told him that she would carry the memory of every stolen glance and suppressed conversation and moment of silent longing into their marriage as proof that what they had found together was worth every moment of suffering it had required. And she sealed her letter with a prayer of gratitude that patience and courage had finally led them both home to where they had always belonged. Eleanor woke on her wedding morning to sunlight streaming through her window and the sealed letter resting on her bedside table where she had placed it the night before, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax and unfolded the pages to discover words that somehow captured both the gravity of the commitment they were about to make and the profound joy of finally claiming what had been denied them for so long. For he had written that today marked not merely a wedding, but rather the formal acknowledgement of a connection that had existed in silence and shadow for 3 years, and as she dressed in the gown of ivory silk that had been chosen to complement rather than compete with Rosalind's more elaborate confection, she felt a peace settle over her that came from knowing she was walking toward a future built on genuine recognition rather than compromise or settling. The ceremony itself unfolded in the ancient stone church, filled with summer blooms and golden light, and when Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw nothing but the Duke waiting at the altar, with an expression that validated every moment of suffering and patience, for his eyes held a mixture of wonder and certainty, and such profound love that she felt tears threatening to spill before she had even reached his side. And beside him stood Lord Pemberton, waiting for Rosalind, with his own expression of besotted happiness that confirmed both sisters had found exactly what they needed rather than what society had expected them to want. The vows they exchanged carried a weight of meaning that only those who had wandered through years of unspoken longing could fully appreciate, and when the Duke promised to honor and cherish her, Eleanor heard the echo of every stolen glance and suppressed conversation and moment when they had chosen duty over desire, and her own promises emerged from a place of hard-won wisdom about the difference between being chosen by default and being selected with full awareness and intention. and as they were pronounced husband and wife, and he kissed her with a tenderness that acknowledged both their public audience and their private history, she felt the final dissolution of the invisible girl who had watched from the shadows, and the emergence of a woman who had learned her own worth through suffering. The celebration that followed sparkled with genuine joy, rather than mere social obligation, and Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers who seemed to understand that something precious had been claimed from the wreckage of convention. And as evening drew near, and she stood beside her husband watching Rosalind dance with Lord Pemberton, she felt her sister's hand squeeze hers briefly in a gesture of solidarity that spoke of their transformed relationship, and the Duke drew her into the dance floor for a waltz that felt like an echo of that charged moment. 3 years prior, when they had first touched while pretending their hearts were not racing in tandem, and he whispered that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never doubted her visibility or worth, and she replied that he had already given her the greatest gift by waiting until they both understood what they were choosing. 5 years later, Eleanor stood in the walled garden of their country estate, watching her children play among the roses, while the Duke approached with their youngest daughter in his arms, and the scene held an almost dreamlike quality of domestic happiness that seemed impossible given the suffering that had preceded it, for their partnership had deepened into something that encompassed not merely romantic love, but also intellectual companionship and shared purpose in managing the estate and supporting the charitable endeavors that had always been. Eleanor's passion and evidence of their collaboration existed in every aspect of their life together, from the reformed tenant conditions to the school they had established in the village, to the way they made decisions as genuine partners rather than following the traditional hierarchy that relegated wives to decorative roles. That evening, as the children were settled, and they sat together in the library that had become their private sanctuary, the Duke pulled Eleanor into his arms and reflected that perhaps those 3 years of waiting had been necessary to forge them into people capable of appreciating what they had found. And Eleanor agreed, while also acknowledging that she would not wish to repeat the suffering even knowing its ultimate purpose, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the fire paint shadows on the walls, while outside, the last light faded from a sky that had witnessed their entire journey, from invisible longing to acknowledged love, and she understood that some stories required patience and sacrifice before they could reach their proper ending. But the waiting had made the claiming all the more precious. Dear listener, there is wisdom in Eleanor's journey that extends beyond the particulars of her story. For how many of us have stood in the shadows believing ourselves invisible while waiting for recognition that seemed destined never to arrive, and how many have convinced themselves that being overlooked was a reflection of their worth rather than a failure of perception in those doing the looking. And yet Eleanor's transformation teaches us that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in demanding immediate acknowledgement, but in maintaining faith in our own value, even when the world seems determined to ignore it. And her story reminds us that being chosen second can sometimes mean being chosen correctly, with full awareness and intention rather than superficial attraction or social expectation. And while patience in the face of suffering is painful, it can also create depths of understanding and appreciation that easy happiness never achieves. And so perhaps the lesson is this: you deserve to be seen fully and chosen deliberately by someone who recognizes your worth, not despite your quiet strength, but because of it. Someone who will wait through seasons of difficulty for the privilege of claiming your hand. And if you find yourself standing in the shadows, watching others receive the attention you secretly crave, remember that the right recognition comes not from being the loudest or most obvious, but from being authentic enough that those the wisdom to truly see will eventually find you. And may you find the courage to wait for that genuine connection rather than settling for whatever scraps of attention come your way. And may you rest tonight knowing that your worth exists independent of others' ability to perceive it. And may your own story of patience and recognition unfold in its proper time, bringing you the love you deserve. This story comes to you from Love and Deepness, where we believe in the transformative power of patience, the courage required for vulnerability, and the profound joy of being truly seen. And if Eleanor's journey resonated with your own experiences of waiting and hoping, and finally claiming what you deserved, please share this story with someone who needs the reminder that being overlooked is temporary, but genuine worth is permanent. And subscribe to continue receiving stories that honor the complexity of the human heart and the courage it takes to believe in happy endings, even when they require years of faith to manifest, for we are all writing our own stories of transformation, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters are the ones that required the longest patience to reach.